Back in 2022, the predictions were just apocalyptic. As Russia started shutting off the gas pipelines, the consensus was pretty clear. The Kremlin's energy weapon was aimed right at the heart of the European economy. A brutal, brutal winter was coming. I mean, the headlines were screaming about blackouts, about industrial collapse, about people freezing in their own homes. The prevailing belief was that these comfortable Western democracies would just fracture under the pressure. Moscow was absolutely betting that winter was its most powerful ally in this new energy war. But here's the thing. The continent didn't collapse. The lights stayed on, the radiators, for the most part, stayed hot. So the real question isn't whether Europe survived. It did. The real questions are how, and more importantly, at what cost. Okay, let's really dive into this. What Europe managed to pull off in the months that followed was, and I'm not exaggerating, one of the most astonishing logistical pivots in modern economic history. This was a full-scale emergency reconstruction of an entire continent's energy architecture done on the fly. The sheer scale of this change is just staggering. Think about it. In 2021, the EU depended on Russian pipelines for about 45% of its natural gas. By 2024, that number was effectively zero. This wasn't some gradual planned shift. This was a radical amputation. Let's just take Germany as a case study, the industrial heart of Europe and Russia's single biggest customer. This is a country, remember, where building a new airport can take over a decade. And yet, they managed to build their very first floating terminal for liquefied natural gas in just 194 days. That is an infrastructure build-out at wartime speed. So, how'd they do it? Well, the strategy was really multi-pronged. First, Europe went on a massive global shopping spree, using its immense wealth to outbid pretty much everyone, including developing nations, for every available LNG tanker on the seas. Second, allies like Norway pushed their production to the absolute max. And third, thanks to a mix of mild winters and real conservation efforts, there was a 19% drop in gas consumption. Okay, but we have to be critical here. We have to ask the tough question. A huge part of that so-called demand reduction wasn't just people turning down their thermostats. It was factories turning off their machines. For good. And this right here is the first real hint at the hidden cost of this survival story. And that brings us to the financial price tag. To stop a full-blown economic and social meltdown, European governments didn't just find new sources of gas. No, they unleashed a torrent of public money to cushion the blow. Just look at this figure, over 750 times billion euros. That's the amount governments set aside to shield their citizens and their companies from the price shock. To put that into perspective for you, that is roughly the entire annual GDP of a country like Switzerland, spent in just a couple of years. So the big question is, where did a sum that massive actually go? It wasn't just one single policy. This was a massive, continent-wide economic intervention on a scale we've rarely seen before. Well, a huge chunk of it went directly to capping household energy bills and to direct cash payments to stop widespread energy poverty. But billions were also used for massive corporate bailouts, like when Germany had to nationalize the energy giant Uniper just to prevent a Lehman Brothers-style collapse of their entire energy market. And this, right here, reveals who the biggest financial winner of this whole crisis was. As Europe was desperately scrambling for new suppliers, American LNG exports to the continent just skyrocketed. This represents a massive transfer of wealth from European taxpayers to global energy producers, and chief among them was the United States. You see, what we're looking at here is a fundamental shift in the entire European economic model. For decades, German industry ran on what you could call the peace dividend, that cheap, reliable pipeline gas from Russia. Well, that era is over. It's been replaced by the freedom premium, paying significantly more for gas from allies as a cost of security. And that premium, that extra cost, it's left the deepest and maybe the most permanent scar from this entire crisis: the damage to Europe's industrial competitiveness. Think about it. For 50 years, the formula for Germany's success was simple: combine world-class engineering with cheap Russian energy to create a global export machine. That formula is now broken. With energy prices in Europe stabilizing at maybe 2 to 3 times the level in the US, many of these energy-intensive industries are, well, they're just not viable anymore. And look, the numbers don't lie, they're stark. What we're seeing is a kind of slow-motion deindustrialization. Key sectors like chemicals, glass, paper, steel, they've seen production slashed by around 20%. These are not temporary pauses. These are structural, long-term shifts. I mean, this quote from an executive at the chemical giant BASF, it really says it all, doesn't it? The pillars of German industry are now actively shifting their new investments abroad, to the United States for cheaper energy or to China to be closer to their customers. This is the hollowing out of Europe's industrial core happening in real time. Okay, so this brings us to the final cost, and it might be the most important one, the geopolitical cost. Europe successfully broke its dependency on a hostile neighbor. That's true. But in doing so, it has embraced a completely new set of risks and dependencies. All right, so let's look at the before picture. This is 2021. You had one dominant supplier, Russia, holding 45% of the market. It was a single point of failure, a clear and obvious vulnerability that, as we saw, Moscow was more than willing to exploit. And now here's the after picture. On the surface, it looks more diversified. And in many ways it is. The reliance is now spread across multiple, more reliable partners. But notice the big shift. Europe has traded a dependency on a single pipeline for a dependency on the volatile global LNG market. And this new model, it comes with a whole new set of vulnerabilities. Now, a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, a labor strike in Australia, or even just a shift in American domestic politics can cause massive price spikes in Berlin. Relying on the US isn't risk-free. A future administration could easily decide to prioritize low domestic prices over exports, leaving Europe high and dry all over again. So where does that leave us? What's the final verdict on Europe's energy war? Well, it's a story of survival, for sure, but it's far more complex than just a simple story of victory or defeat. Look, when you boil it all down, Putin's energy weapon was a one-time shot, and it failed. He bet that Europe was too weak and too divided to endure the pain, and he was wrong. In firing that weapon, Russia has lost its single biggest customer, and it's likely forever. But let's be clear, the Europe that came out the other side of this crisis is a different place. It is poorer, its industrial base is weakened, and it is far more dependent on the United States. The era of cheap energy that fueled its prosperity is over. And this leaves us with the final, really unsettling question. Europe proved it could survive, yes, but for its long-term competitiveness, was the price it paid really worth it?